Hey everyone, and welcome back to the YellowCard channel for another long-awaited session of CramSchool. Today, we'll be talking about the importance of tracking your opponent's hand, as well as applications of why this can help improve your win rate through all three formats. But first, a message from our sponsor, Strictly Broken TCG, where you go for your Bushiroad card game needs. Beco Melody has recently dropped and you need to support your favorite idol in the upcoming elections to get them to that #1 slot. Are you really the world's biggest closest simp if you don't own 4 LSRs? Use the discount code SBTCG ITSTOKUTV for 8% off your singles order at checkout. Once again, that's SBTCG ITSTOKUTV. And now back to our regular scheduled program. The beautiful thing about this game called Cardfight Vanguard is that a reasonably large percentage of the game is public. You see what your opponent searches up with effects. You see what your opponent drive checks for the turn. The board is public, there's no such thing as a face down zone, so you don't accidentally attack into mirror forces and such. And more so, if your opponent G-assists, their initial 5 cards in hand are also public now as well. As the game progresses on, the only cards you won't know about are blind draws off of effects and for draws for turn. But the player will often drive check more than they draw. More information becomes public as turns progress. So, what is the point of tracking hand? There's a few applications as to why it's important, and I'll run over them with you here. The most obvious one is to track your opponent's guard in hand. Obviously, if your opponent double or triple triggered you last turn, they now have 2 or 3 triggers in hand to guard with. On the other hand, if your opponent shows grade 3s, you now know that they have fewer valid cards to defend with, save for some exceptions such as Die Liner and Heal Guardians, but I digress. Just know that the first application of tracking your opponent's hand is to know their guard values in hand. A second less obvious application of tracking drive checks is knowledge of important pieces. This comes in hand when playing against decks that run few copies of key pieces, be it due to restrictions or deck building constraints. For example, in a hyperbolic thought experiment, if you were to be playing against Shadow Paladin in the V format, and your opponent drive checks in the main, a lot of information is opened up and a lot of decision trees closed too. You now know that they can't be playing the ward and are most likely on the PBD Superior Ride engine, in which case it might be a better idea to play more aggressively rather than cautiously, since we don't want to give Luard Counterblast to play with, but we do want to avoid giving the PBD player free turns at grade 3 without pressure. In another vein, let's say that we are playing against Bastion as Prison, and we noted that they drove check a follow-up order of Chosen Knights, and through the use of Rosat Pink, they imprisoned an Alden from hand. It would be in our best interest as the Prison player to aim to avoid giving the Bastion player any more than 2 Counterblast. This then chokes them of a decision tree of deciding between using Counterblast to free units of Prison, using Soul to free Alden, then using the 2 Counterblast to draw 2 new cards, or using the Counterblast for the Order and any other card. Let's say that we weren't paying attention to what our opponent drove check and we just kept swinging face, hit them to 3. With 3 open counterblasts now, the Bastion player has many more options available to them. They can call out the Alden from Prison, draw 2 new cards, also use the Order from hand to get 2 new cards again. If we had paid attention and noticed that they did get that Order in hand through a drive check, we probably would not have given them that 3rd counterblast to play with. The third and last example for this CramSchool session is knowing how and what to guard for. Once out of the hand and deck, the location of your opponent's 16 triggers is common knowledge. Be it within their soul, their drop zone, or damage, you're able to discern how many triggers they are out, and thus how many are left between their deck and hand combined. Now, with the exception of blind draws, you should also know an estimation of triggers that are in your opponent's hand, and therein, know an approximate value of triggers in their deck, which, in conclusion, leads you to know how much to guard for safely and what to. In example, let's say the turn prior, your opponent drive checks 2 triggers but didn't use either of them to guard on your last turn. As they go into their turn, you get a trigger count and find 13 triggers spread between the soul, the drop, and damage. Because you know that they still have the 2 triggers in hand because you are a good player and have been tracking their drive checks and guards, you know that a guard for 2 to pass is impossible to break here. Let's delve a bit deeper into the application to track your opponent's guard. I find that making examples very hyper-specific helps to illustrate the point. So, in our example, we are playing in the overdressed format as Nirvana against Bruce. It is Bruce's turn right now, and in this example, we both have 2 cards in hand and Bruce is at 5 damage on Death's Door, and so are we with 1 open counterblast. They swing at face and we drop down the perfect guard for free. And off the top of their 2 drive checks, they get 2 perfect guards. So now, in their hand, we know that they have 2 PGs and 2 unknown cards. Off the top of our deck, we rip off an over trigger. Not as good. Guess our only option here is to swing. Now, my question to you is, do you counterblast for the skill? Now, normally, that plus 10k does make a pretty big difference, as if they don't have triggers to guard with, 23 and 23 on the sides is a very strong number. But we've been following our opponent's drive checks, and we noticed that they got PGs in hand. Even more so if they were to get triggers in hand as well. Triggers would guard the 23 very safely, at least on the rear guard column. So my argument here is, because you know that this 10k doesn't matter because you know what's in your opponent's hand, don't use the counterblast. Save it for a turn where it does matter, like when they get grade 3s, grade 2s, grade 1s off their drive checks and aren't able to guard with. In a less scripted example, we're playing in the premium format as Nova Grapplers against Kagero, and our opponent drove check a heel trigger. Heel trigger, Kagero, think of it. We have enough for lethal in our hand. Do we go for it? Once again, we've trapped a heel trigger in our opponent's hand. It is probably best to bait out the Denial Griffin before we aim to go for a kill, lest we blow all of our resources only to have our key attacker retired by Denial Griffin and prematurely end our turn. One last thing I want to mention about hand tracking opponent's guard is estimating how much shield value they have. This is easiest in the overdress format, but can be easily applied to other formats with varying shield values too, just by adding more variables. In overdress, we have at the moment 3 major shield values: 15k on triggers, 5k on grade 1s and 2s, and infinity on PG. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, like front triggers and Kokabiel. Now, instead of mathematically always adding 15 to 15, then adding 5 to 30, then your opponent guarded with a trigger, so you do 30 minus 15, then they drive check 2 blank, so that you get plus 0. But then they drew off the top of their deck 2 blind new cards, and most likely there should be some guard in there, so you give them 20. We can do some simple algebra instead. You can set the value A to represent triggers, B to represent grade 1s and 2s, and C's for PGs. As the game progresses and you see cards get added to your opponent's hand through drive checks and searches, you can tick 1 up on each of these letters, and as your opponent guards with said cards or calls them down, you can tick 1 down on them as well. I tend to resolve blind draws as a +1B, since the majority of most decks, are grade 1s and grade 2s, and the average shield between triggers and grade 3s is also about 7.5, which rounds to 5 when you take magic numbers into account. Let's say that my opponent drew a card for a turn, drove check 3 times for 2 triggers and a PG. I would say my opponent's hand has 2A, 1B, 1C in hand for guard. So mathematically that's about 35k and a PG. On my turn, after my attacks are said and done, my opponent guarded with a PG, discarding a grade 1 and guarding with a trigger. At the end of my turn, my opponent's hand is now at 1A. Going into my opponent's turn again, they will draw a card for turn, and off their drive checks, they get a grade 3 and a grade 3. They're now at 1A plus 1B, so about 20 cards in hand to guard. At this point, I'm going to evaluate my hand, see if I have the potential to end the game here, since I know that their guard value is low. Using this method instead of always doing raw arithmetics is a lot easier to track guard. It can help you make decisions on when is a good time to go for the kill. In any case, that's all I've got to say for today's segment on YellowCard CramSchool. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought about the lesson, if you have any extra info to add about your experience with hand tracking, and what other lessons you'd like for us to cover next. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button and like if you haven't yet. Follow our socials on Twitter and Twitch, and I will see you next time. This has been Toku from YellowCard Vanguard. Toku out.